It's Chris Bedford time. Bedford recently sat down with Rachel Bovard to discuss the CR vote, which is now in the Senate, the lack of Democratic defense, and more. Take a look.
Joining me now is Rachel Bovard, Vice President of Programs at the Conservative Partnership Institute, and a longtime Senate observer, participant person who's just been in and around politics and government for her entire career. And you might have seen some of her speeches that have gone viral, of course, at different conferences, at National Conservatism and others, and a friend of the show. Rachel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm taking a look at this deal is coming out on a Friday. It looks like the CR is coming to a head on Friday. They're having a vote. And I'm wondering, why on a Friday? I mean, I guess it spooks the markets. Is this a tactic by Republicans? The House Representatives passed this, I think, on a Tuesday, and then they left town. They're gone. They could have started moving right away. But is this a hardball tactic that Republicans are playing?
Yeah, Congress loves to go right up to the deadline. It's you need the pressure to force any action, particularly in the Senate. But it is interesting that we're seeing the House jam the Senate in this regard, because usually it's the opposite, right? Usually it's the Senate that passes something, says, okay, and then leaves town and says, okay, House, deal with it. But we're seeing that in reverse this time. House Republicans have passed this bill and they've left town. They sent it over to the Senate. Now, under the Senate's rules, they can't move to it immediately. It has to be Rule 14 to the calendar, and then there's a certain amount of time that has to elapse before the Senate can move to it. But in that time, that's when all the negotiations happen. You're seeing a lot of posturing from Democrats who say, well, we're not going to provide the votes for this. Okay. You want to play brinksmanship up until the deadline. That's exactly what Republicans will make them do to own a shutdown if there is one. But my sense is that I think this is potentially going to get through. It might be at the deadline, but it will get through.
I can't think of a time that Democrats have led a government shutdown since Reagan versus Tip O'Neill. Do any come to mind for you? You've covered this pretty closely. You've lived through and worked through a bunch of Republican backbench-led shutdowns.
There was a small shutdown in the beginning of the first Trump administration that was actually Republican-led, but to some extent, but it was pinned as the Schumer shutdown. And I think it was the first time Republicans made a successful attempt to pin this on Democrats. It was over the border. And the difference there was a number of things had already been funded at that point for the year. So defense had been funded. A lot of the veterans issues, like the critical issues that people really focus on during a shutdown, those were already funded. So this just was a partial shutdown. So it's not completely analogous, but it is an interesting quandary for Democrats to be in, because on one hand, they hate everything DOJ is doing, but on the other hand, a shutdown is also going to hurt the federal workers that they now have lifted up to sainthood. So it's a question of optics are really important for them as well. And do they want to be seen as being obstructionists? Can they fundraise sufficiently enough to make it worth it? I suspect at the end of the day, the answer is going to be no to those questions, and they're going to give the votes to Republicans. But we'll see. I've been wrong before, so we'll see.
What is the difference? What explains the difference in the philosophical way that the different parties seem to approach this? I mean, Republican leadership, at least as far as I've ever watched, has never been very eager to shut down anything. They've always thought of shutting down the federal government as a bad thing. This usually comes from the backbenches of the GOP, or the conservative right wing of the GOP, who says, no, we're not doing this. We're not funding Obamacare. We're against this. This was passed. This was passed in bad faith, and we want to fight against it, or something like that. And then Republican leadership is kind of dragged kicking and screaming. The Democrats appear to be leading this from their top ranks. I mean, Senator Chuck Schumer is one of the people out there saying, we'll shut it down. But it kind of strikes me as like your child saying, I will destroy my favorite teddy bear. And you know that they won't. I mean, maybe to their brother that teddy bear means nothing. That's a real threat. But to the actual kid whose bear it is. And Democrats don't seem very good at shutting down, and I'm not convinced that they even have it in them. The government is their precious.
Right. I don't think they do. I think the position they find themselves in now is they're facing an existential crisis, right? Elon Musk and Donald Trump are literally shutting down agencies, right? USAID is gone. And the Department of Education is, literally half of what it was. So I think there's a lot of pressure for them to step forward in this moment and take unprecedented action. But that being said, I don't think they have it in them. So I think what we're seeing now is we're going through the stages of grief. But this, we're going through, the foot stomping and the tantrum throwing, which is necessary, I think, for their base to see. They have to do this performative sackcloth and ashes routine to be able to go on cable news.
To please the God.
Right. Exactly. They have to do this ritual shaming of Donald Trump and everything, and then they're going to give the votes. Because at the end of the day, I don't think they can withstand, not being the adults in the room. And I don't think that their party is prepared. Their party is so fractured also on so many different things. If you're going to go into a shutdown, you really, I think, and speaking as someone who has worked through many of them on the Republican side, you have to have message unity and you have to have strategic unity and focus. And I think Democrats are so fractured in this moment that even if they were to shut the government down, I don't think they could sustain it for more than a day or two because their party is just so split and I think running on vibes at this point. And so I don't think if they were to stumble into a shutdown, I think it would be a very short one.
And that seems to be a whole thing with the Democrats. I mean, for years and years and years, we were treated to moral blackmail and mixed with this championing of really left-wing causes. Transgenderism wasn't just something that was fair and merciful. It was something that ought to be glorified and vaunted. Same thing with abortion. Same thing with illegal immigrants. The act of love on steroids sort of thing. Same thing with the criminal. Have mercy on the criminal, not just because the criminal may have had a bad background, but because we shouldn't be hard on them. We don't understand them, this or that, and they're actually resistance fighters or the voices of the unheard, the riots and everything. You don't hear anything like that anymore. It's all process. No, very few, other than basically Senator Chris Murphy, no one's out there defending foreign aid. No one's out there defending the incredible wasteful spending of the government. They're actually kind of wishing that they had cut some of that themselves. People aren't even defending illegal immigrants. Like, you don't see AOC crying at the border anymore. They seem to only be having arguments about the process and where Republicans have the power or the authority or the legal authority. And that's seems like a harder thing to motivate people on. Have you noticed this shift, or am I way off?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of, to their credit, some self-awareness that these issues lost, right? That the country, being on the 20% side of an 80% issue is a bad place for them to be. I think there are some people that are recognizing this. And, I think that they are in this disarray, to use this sort of overused phrase, of trying to figure out how to move forward. And there's a lot of, grasping and trying to triangulate. You're already seeing some Democrats take that position of, Gavin Newsom, I think, is leading that charge, right? Actually, it's a bad idea for boys to be in girls' sports, right? Wow. The grasping for the 80% issue. And I just think that they haven't sort of coalesced as a party around how to do this going forward. They're still very much in the picking up the pieces phase. And that's why I think, again, going back to the idea of a shutdown, I think it would just fail spectacularly, because you have to have message discipline and strategic unity to be able to sustain something like that. And that is not what we're seeing. They are, I think, very much looking for a victim to hold up. Right? They need something to show as a martyr, and the best they can come up with at this point is the federal workforce, which is so deeply unpopular across the country that even these process arguments, I think, fail and fail to resonate. Because I think a lot of the country is looking at Washington, D.C. and saying, actually, this is what I voted for. And even if they didn't vote for this, it's such an unsympathetic group of people because these services have been failing the American people for so long that Democrat attempts to paint them all as victims and martyrs, at least at this juncture, are not working.
I feel like the story that's going on right now, even that you saw Secretary of State Marco Rubio responding to, the arrest and detainment of a green card holding terror activist who was shutting down campuses in New York, that would have been all over the news 8 years ago. Somebody with a pregnant wife, someone who was married to an American. This would be the top source of outrage. But that moral blackmail is not really seeming to land the same way that it had previously. People just speak. Republicans and rhinos are no longer cowering in the way they did. You have people like Rubio out there saying, well, if you want to come to this country and support terror and attack Jewish students and shut down classes, then you have to leave. And this is not a right that you have as a foreigner. Do you see this change seems to be in the GOP in general? The Senate, which you've been a long time frustrated observer of, is the slowest place to change in all of Washington, D.C. Some people seem to be playing cards right now, but do you actually think that What is the future right now of that resistance in the Senate that you started to see bubble up over nominees? It kind of faded into the background now. Now we're at this fight. These first 50 days in the Trump administration, how are those relations with Capitol Hill going?
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch because, I've said often the Senate is the laggiest of the lagging indicators in Washington. It's always like 10 years behind where the country is. And, but they're in a position now where even if they don't totally support everything that Trump is doing, or historically, they haven't supported tariffs or, things that he's doing, 5 years ago, they would have spoken up maybe on behalf of this green card holder that, Rubio is trying to deport. The base is so much behind what Donald Trump is doing, and he has built such a movement that it's almost boxed Senate Republicans in. And this is politics, right? And that's they have now found themselves in the position of, being dragged along by this momentum behind Donald Trump. And you've seen it, very early on when there was some initial resistance to Pete Hegseth or some of the president's nominees. Those senators stepped out and got their heads taken off. And that was an object lesson in many cases for the rest of these members. It's not that they simply, line up and support these noms, but they know now if they have issues or there are concerns, that those concerns need to be telegraphed to the White House privately. Right? We don't live in this world anymore where the Senate tries to hold its own, Senate Republicans try to hold its own Republican administration hostage. No, Donald Trump is very much in charge of the Republican Party. And I think the senators are aware of that. So I do think that they are aware of the tremendous momentum that has followed Donald Trump. And in many cases, their own voters, are part of that. So I do think it has been, and the Senate has been cooperative in many cases, right? They've confirmed to Donald Trump's cabinet. They are now working on the sub-cabinet. They are prepared in most cases to give him the votes for the CR. And I think that's to the credit of Donald Trump. He is dragging everyone across the finish line in the wake of his tremendous popularity and the momentum he's created.
I know you have to go in a moment. So just one last question about where the Senate goes from here. You've seen Senator Lindsey Graham, who's in election year, so once again, he's conservative, pushing for the idea of codifying DOGE in a way that I think no one really expected that they'd be able to do. We could get a simple majority for the Senate to claw back money by its own decision that it has previously appropriated. Do you think plans like this are going to actually happen in the U.S. Senate, or are politicians in the House and the Senate still too wary of DOGE and everything that's going on to really want to put their fingerprints on anything?
This is going to be the real test, I think, for where Republicans actually are, because it's easy to confirm nominations, right? That's an expected thing the Senate does. But to actually codify significant change, that's a bigger test. And you're already seeing some senators come out and start to concern troll about DOGE, right? You're seeing Susan Collins as head of the Appropriations Committee, Lisa Murkowski, another big appropriator. The appropriators are starting to come out and say, well, I don't like the process by which this is being done. Needless to say, by the way, they've all of them have run for election on downsizing the federal government and, holding the workforce more accountable. But now it's actually happening in a way that's meaningful and effective. And while the process, we don't like the process by which this is being done. So I do think, when the light and the heat fades on the nominations fights, this is the real test of where the Republican Senate is going to be. And I think codifying this is actually meaningful change, right? Because we see change at the executive level can be undone by the next guy. You want these changes in place, they have to go through Congress. And I think whether this is the real litmus test of where Republicans are. And I think it'll be an uphill fight, but I think the more it's exposed to the daylight and the more people see it, I think the pressure is going to be on them to do something.